is to ask ourselves, where are the opportunities through what government does and its policy, regulatory and investment settings to make a real difference? And just if I look back over my shoulder, the changes we made to WAF and COF are an example that came from this GIC. It was saying, instead of just playing around at the fringe, could we make some real changes? And those WAF and COF changes that we made a few years ago released something like $1.8 billion worth of value back into the economy through your businesses and through households not having such high compliance costs. So that's the sort of thing we're trying to challenge ourselves to think about. Now, why is that all relevant to this question of the future? Well, part of our attempt to influence the transport system means that we need to both think about the whole of the transport system and we need to think about it in the longer term. Because if we're going to really fulfill our purpose and deliver on that greatest imaginable challenge, I think we have to have a pretty clear view about where the opportunities are to have greatest impact on the system to drive greater value. So that's why we've been doing a lot more thinking about the way things might be 30 years from now, and asking ourselves just how might the transport system and mobility change over the next few decades, and where are the opportunities for us to start to have some influence over it. Now, the difficulty with starting to think about the way the world could be in 30 years' time is that imagining the future is pretty damn hard, right? We don't have a crystal ball. We don't have any sort of stronger basis than you do to kind of imagine what tomorrow might bring. And I'm really mindful also as we think about this that most of us tend to influence what the future, or our thinking about the future, is based on what we've experienced in the past. And often we're quite constrained in our thinking about the future simply because past experience may not be, in this context, the best predictor of the future. And yet we all know that in 30 years a lot can happen. And when I start talking about 30 years, I'm often reminded of the life of my grandmother. My grandmother lived with us as a family when I was a teenager. She was born in 1894 out at Cusp, and that was 4 years before the first automobiles came to New Zealand in 1898. So when she was a young girl, in the early 1900s, I'm sure out in Cusp and around Christchurch there were cars, right? So I'm sure she saw the odd car about as a young girl. But I equally bet that she couldn't have imagined in the early 1900s as a 7 or 8 year old that 30 years later there would be cars like this. Now this happens to be my car, but it happens to also have been the car that my grandmother and grandfather bought new in 1927 here in Christchurch. I now own this. I bought it at Christmas off a farmer who had it in a shed at Waiā for the last 10 years or so. So this car was my grandparents' car in 1927. Rattled around Cusp and around Christchurch back then. As I say, she couldn't have possibly imagined that there would be vehicles like this when she was in her 30s. And yet in the 1930s, when this car was relatively new, we also know that commercial aviation was fledgling. You know, she would have seen aeroplanes in the sky around North Canterbury, and she may have known the odd person who'd been in an aeroplane. But I doubt in the early 1930s she could have possibly imagined that 30 years later we'd have Boeing 747s flying in our skies, let alone that man would land on the moon. So the point I'm trying to make is what can happen in 30 years is beyond our imagination. And certainly there are 2 paradigm shifts in transportation that occurred in the life of my grandmother. But it's happened in our lifetimes as well. I was reminded a few months ago in transit on the way back to New Zealand from something I was at, when I was walking around Changi Airport, I was walking past several people who were walking around with their mobile phones speaking into them. And they were clearly FaceTiming or Skyping with folks. Now, I know it's not quite beam me up Scotty, right? But it's not a million miles away, and how many of us, even 10 years ago, would have imagined we could do that? we think about the way mobile technology has altered our lives in the last 10 or 15 years, it is quite phenomenal. So we've seen it happen in our own lifetimes, and I guess my basic contention is that's what we're on the cusp of seeing in transportation and mobility. So what I'm going to do now is share some thinking on what I think the future might hold. Of one thing I can be fairly certain is whatever I tell you, it's going to be wrong, right? Because this is what I'm imagining, it's not what I'm necessarily predicting. But if equally, I think of one thing that I can be certain is that some of you will probably look at the stuff or hear what I say and say, yeah, no, not in my lifetime, it won't happen. My guess is that some of the stuff I'm going to tell you will fall short of what in fact will happen in reality. I believe some of this stuff will probably go faster and further than I can currently imagine. So, let me also just acknowledge, given the nature of your interests, that I'm going to talk first a little bit about mobility. And I know as SILT and IPNs, your main interests will be in transport and logistics related stuff. But I thought I'd start with the mobility stuff anyway, because we all indulge in mobility in the transport system ourselves, so hopefully this will be of some interest to you as well. So I imagine a future where we'll all be able to make very different choices about how our mobility needs are met, and those needs will be much, much more tailored to individual requirements and expectations than they currently are. You'll no longer need to worry about, if you currently do, well, when the bus is coming or what the bus timetable is. You won't be worrying about taxis or similar things. In fact, there won't be buses and there won't be bus stops as we know them today. You won't be worrying in the weekends about trying to clean out the garage to get your car in, because actually my contention is you probably won't own a car in 30 years' time. The reason for that is because you'll buy your mobility as a service. Your ability to buy services that meet your needs will be transformed over the next 30 years in the way that we've seen over the last half-century food supply, which is what this slide is all about. I talked about my grandparents. Look, I remember growing up with my parents having a veggie garden, and they grew vegetables to help feed the family. Today, it doesn't make any sense. My wife perseveres with growing tomatoes in our glass house at home every summer. I tell you what, they're the most expensive tomatoes we consume because it doesn't make any financial sense. Because we can all go to the supermarket or something equivalent. We have more choice, it's more convenient, and it's cheaper than we can possibly do it ourselves. And my contention is that's essentially what's going to happen with mobility. We're going to move into an environment where we're going to have more choice to buy it as a service than to own it and do it ourselves. It'll be cheaper, it'll be more convenient, and we'll have more choice. So you'll be able to decide whether the mobility option you want is to travel in a luxury vehicle on your own and work, or whether you want the leisure option and travel with others and do something else while you're travelling. You'll be able to be confident that a vehicle will be available to pick you up where you want it, to drop you off where you're going, and so on. We won't need parking in our cities because those vehicles will be autonomous and they'll be repurposed and used all the time. So we'll release all the space in our cities that won't be required for parking anymore. Yeah. And look, you saw one of my cars. I'm a self-confessed petrol head. I own 6 cars, right? So here I am saying, I expect my children's children, my grandchildren, will in 30 years' time choose not to own a car. I hope, because I own 3 vintage cars and a couple of classics, that they'll still want to own those, but they won't own that. It'll be like my wife growing tomatoes. They'll do so because their grandfather passed them down to them and it's an interest. But for all other purposes, they'll buy, just like we do our food at the supermarket, their mobility as a service. And let me just pause and think for a moment for that, what that means for how cities might work. The International Transport Forum, which is the OECD think tank on transport, has done an exercise where they've modelled what would happen to a mid-sized European city if the fundamental mode of transport for people for mobility moved to rideshare. They modelled it on Lisbon, and I've actually got some stuff because I was looking at it for a meeting I have in Auckland tomorrow. I'll come to that. And what it shows is that actually for a mid-sized European city like Lisbon, they would only need a vehicle fleet 30% the size of the current fleet to meet all of their mobility requirements. 30%. Now, the point of the Auckland thing is I'm doing a piece of work for the government with Auckland Council trying to get alignment about the 30-year strategy for Auckland. Believe me, I don't have to take 70% off the demand to solve the problem in Auckland. But we're sitting with, you and I as taxpayers with something like a $60 billion invoice for what's required at the moment, at least as the Auckland Council believes, for investment in transport in Auckland. Just imagine if we could make that 40 billion or 30 billion because of this change in the way people choose to travel through shared mobility. I was also just actually looking on the way down this afternoon at a recent McKinsey study that talks about what this means for us as individuals and citizens. So if you move to a world with full autonomy, basically on average across the world, it gives back motorists about 15 minutes a day. What they calculate is, depending on how people choose to use that 15 minutes they get back, they calculate something like a 10 to 15% lift in productivity in the economy. So this is a fundamental shift in not just the way we lead our lives, but the way cities and economies might work. So there you go, there's mobility as a service. But of course, this is a world that, because it becomes, what have I done here? Wrong side. This is a world, of course, that suddenly becomes more complex with all of these choices that we have. And if some of you are like me, and you may not be, but I wear one of these to work most days, and my wife points out that often I choose the wrong tie to go with the suit or the shirt or whatever. So just getting up in the morning and making sensible choices is hard enough, right? My view is that, well, choosing your mobility option might be another complexity to the morning schedule. What will happen in time, just as we've seen with the likes of Google, is systems will develop that will anticipate your every requirement and make sure those needs are met, probably and eventually without even you thinking about it. So smart people will develop whatever the equivalent in 20 or 30 years' time is of an app. Something that will anticipate your requirements and ensure your mobility is there to meet your requirements. In a sense, it'll be like having a virtual butler that will organise all of this for you before you've even recognised you need it. And of course, this is a world where the way we pay for our mobility will also fundamentally change. So buying our mobility as a service means that, like telecommunications and energy, we'll make choices about how we choose to buy that. Some of us will pay as we go. Some of us may well buy packages that guarantee us a certain level of service for a period, and that level of service may be for all modes of transport, including air travel. And embedded in that price will be the network charge. We won't talk about fuel taxes anymore. We won't even talk about road pricing, which we struggle to talk about today. Embedded in the price of the service will be your network access and use charge, and that'll be just like you pay for energy and telecommunications. It'll be a minor part of the service charge from your provider. And that pricing will probably have a surge element to deal with demand management and so on. And of course, we already know that the likes of Uber and so on are doing that. So, I know this is the bit that's probably least interesting from a Silt and IPN's point of view, but that's my view of the future of mobility. Let me turn now to freight and logistics, which is probably closer to your direct set of interests. When I talk about freight and logistics, I often, in other presentations, use a slide that has an image of New Zealand from space. So I invite you just to imagine that rather than see it here. But the reason I use that is I think it's a really helpful reminder of both where we are on the globe and how we make our living as a nation. Because when you see that image of us from space, you're reminded that we're a long way from our trading partners. We're surrounded by a lot of blue stuff, you know, the sea and the air. And for us, because of the way we make our living, international shipping and international aviation are pretty critical to us in our economy and our lifestyle. You folks here will know these things and know more about it than I do. But, you know, with 99% by volume of our exports leaving in ships and 99% of visitors arriving in aircraft, when I talk about the transport system, I'm not just talking about roads and rail. I'm talking about all of these other dimensions. And I'm sure some of you know of the Productivity Commission work 2 or 3 years ago on international freight productivity. And their overall conclusion that sort of broadly was our exporters are paying roughly double what their Australian counterparts are paying for the international leg of their export task. Why? Largely economies of scale. And yet we also know, and again there'll be others in this room who know far more about this and will correct me if I get any of this wrong, I'm sure, that, you know, we've got international shipping lines building these mega ships with, you know, 22 to 25,000 TEU capacity, you know, 400 metres long, massive ships. I don't think any of us really expect to see them in New Zealand. But the point nonetheless is if we want to capture the economies of scale of larger ships, then by definition our challenge is that we're going to have to ship much more freight around the domestic economy one way or another to manage the number of port visits that those larger ships, however large they may be, will make. So the challenge for us is much more around how we think about domestic supply chain, freight and logistics issues, in my view. And so let me share just a few thoughts about how I imagine the future of freight and logistics for us might evolve given the sort of developments that technology might enable. So my view is that we will move to a point where we do have very much freight dedicated corridors for freight and across land, air and sea. And the image here, of course, is of the platooning of heavy trucks. I'm sure some of you know about these things, but of course I've seen studies where they've talked about from trials up to 25% improvement in fuel costs because of the aerodynamic gains from platooning. So the massive opportunities that come from the ability for these vehicles to be electronically connected as road trains, as it were. Of course, we all know the major dilemma in a country like New Zealand is that for all of us as motorists, the idea of being stuck behind 6 or 7 trucks like that on our roading network is kind of a daunting thought, right? So we know that people are talking about dedicated freight lanes for this mode of sort of operation to work. Very hard to imagine in New Zealand how we could deliver that, right? Given the nature of our country and population and so on. But here's a random thought, and I'm sure every time I mention this it winds people up, or at least some people up. But think about this. At the moment, with the exception of Wellington and Auckland, where rail shares a metro system, effectively our rail network is a freight network. And the problem we have with rail is the economics of rail are very hard to make work with 4,500 kilometres of network to maintain and something like 16% of the freight task going on to rail. And you know, folks in this audience here who manage freight and logistics know why stuff goes on rail versus road. Their choices which are about supply chain and the needs. You know, you're not going to put the cornflakes if they need to be in Timaru tomorrow morning on a train if that's not going to keep them there for delivery to the supermarket at 6 a.m. So here's the thought. Given rail is effectively a system that relies on a 19th century guidance system, which is what I think steel rails fundamentally are, what about rethinking the rail corridors as freight corridors? And what if, instead of using a 19th century guidance system, we used a 21st century guidance system? all you'd need is 2 concrete pads that wide for the rubber-tired vehicles to run on. They'd be guided electronically, they'd be autonomous like other vehicles. The network operator wouldn't have to own the rolling stock, just like we don't on the roads. And we'd have a separated corridor for freight without having to spend a whole lot of money on our roading network. Now, just to be really clear, I'm not saying to you, let's close Kiwi Rail tomorrow and do this. All I'm just challenging folks to do is to say, maybe there are options for us to think very differently about how our transport system works that is enabled by technology, to suspend sort of assumptions that we've made based on what has happened in the past, and to think about options that could be very different in the future. And then of course there are these things, these airships. So, you know, some of these ideas with airships are under development and being trialled in different parts of the world, and I've seen reference to projections in the longer term of having payloads of 500 tonnes, capacity to travel up to 10,000 kilometres at over 200 kilometres an hour. And the reason I've shown an image of an airship with a ship, of course, is the interesting thing about airships is they don't have all of the land infrastructure requirements that conventional aircraft require. They don't need airports with long landing strips. They don't necessarily need ports to lift and remove freight from ships. So again, that option about how do you get economies of scale and deal with the movement of